each type of question: prediction, inference, detail, big picture, or connection. Shade the question the correct color. Answer each question using complete sentences. Shortish story number 9. Sandy felt the mattress shift when Ted got into bed. Groggy, she looked over at the clock. It was 3 in the morning. He was just coming home. Sandy felt a lump in her throat. It wasn't the first time Ted had stayed out all night. He'd been doing it more and more over the past few months. When they'd moved in together 3 years ago, he'd stayed out late like that every once in a while, but it was becoming a weekly occurrence. She suspected he had met someone else. Great, she thought. I'm 54 and I'm about to have another failed relationship. Her oldest son had never liked Ted, and he'd be more than happy to tell her, "I told you so." So you'll pause and there's a couple questions to answer. Number 1, what does Sandy think Ted is doing when he's staying out late? Number 2, how does she feel about this? Write an answer that describes her emotions, then go back and highlight text evidence to support your inference. Why don't you like him? Sandy had asked Taylor after she'd introduced him and Ted for the first time. He just gives me a bad vibe. When he smiles, his eyes look kind of flat, Taylor had said. Mom, you're a grown woman. You can date whoever you want, but don't bring him over to my house again. I don't want him around my kids. Sandy had been upset, but she'd gone to Taylor's house by herself after that. Surprisingly, Ted didn't seem to mind. He's your son, Ted said. What you do with your kids is your business. I have my own private business. At our age, we don't have to share everything to be together. At the time, she'd felt relieved, but now Sandy wondered if that disinterest in her family had been a red flag. Maybe he was never that interested in me, she thought. Maybe I shouldn't have pushed him so hard to move in together. Okay, you would pause. There's a couple more questions. Number 3, what does it mean if you see red flags in a relationship? Number 4, what red flags has Sandy noticed with Ted? Number 5, do you think Sandy's son Taylor is being reasonable when he asks Sandy not to bring Ted around his kids? Why or why not? She could hear Ted snoring. He could fall asleep at the drop of a hat. It didn't matter what had happened during his day. At night, she would beg him to turn off the news before bed. She hated hearing about the murders and robberies. It gave her nightmares. Ted fell right asleep while Sandy lay there awake. If Ted was cheating, she wanted to know now. There wasn't any point in dragging things out. The next time Ted said he was going out with friends, she would follow him. Then she'd know exactly where she stood. Sandy didn't have to wait long. The following Tuesday, Ted came home from work, changed clothes, and said he was meeting some friends for drinks and he'd be home late. He kissed her on the cheek, grabbed his car keys, and left. Sandy waited a few minutes before grabbing her own car keys and following behind him. Ted drove all the way across town. Already, Sandy was suspicious. His office was only a couple of blocks from their apartment, so why would people from work want to meet at a bar all the way over here? She parked across the street and watched him sit at a table in front of one of the bar's big glass windows. He ordered a drink and sat by himself for a long time. Maybe his friends are running late, Sandy reasoned. So far, he hasn't done anything wrong. What am I doing? She said out loud to herself. I'm being paranoid. What's wrong with me? Couple more questions. Number 6. Do you think Sandy is doing the right thing by secretly following Ted? Why or why not? Number 7. If you were Sandy, what would you have done? Why? That's when the small blonde woman sat down across from him. Sandy held her breath. Maybe she was someone from work. Ted leaned across the table and kissed the woman on the cheek. Maybe she was someone from work he really liked? The woman held Ted's hand as they held up their phones looking at the screens. Sandy immediately knew what they were doing. She'd done the same thing when she was online dating before she'd met Ted. They were comparing their faces to the photos on their profiles. This was a date. When Ted and the woman left the bar together in Ted's car, Sandy followed them. When Ted pulled the car into a wooded area, she felt sick to her stomach. He'd done the same thing on their first date. The thought of her, Ted, making out with another woman made her want to scream. She thought about getting out and confronting him, especially after she heard the grunts and screams coming from the back seat and saw the car rocking back and forth. But she didn't. She would talk to him later when she was calm. She'd tell him what she saw, then ask him to move out. Right now, however, she had to pee. She slipped out of her car and went behind the trees. As she squatted there, she heard Ted's car drive away. At least he won't see me sitting there in the car, she thought. I can save a little bit of my dignity. As Sandy made her way back to her car to go home, she heard a sound coming from the clearing where Ted and the blonde woman had parked for their encounter. It was a low, gurgling moan. What was it? "Hello?" Sandy called nervously. The gurgling moan came again. This time, Sandy felt sure it was a person. She moved cautiously towards the clearing. "Is somebody there?" she called. When Sandy reached the clearing, she gasped. There, laying on the ground, was a woman in the center of a pool of blood. Sandy recognized the woman's blonde hair. The rest of her was unrecognizable from the bruises and stab wounds. Sandy fumbled for her cell phone and dialed 911. She'd been wrong about everything. Okay, last few questions. Number 8, what did Sandy think Ted was doing? And what text evidence made her think that? Number 9, what was Ted actually doing? Write a response, then go back and highlight evidence that allowed you to come to that conclusion. Number 10, what do you think will happen now that Sandy has discovered Ted's secret? So for that question, imagine you're going to keep writing another chapter. What do you think the author would write? After that, there's a writing portion to complete, and then you'll be done.